I'm Marta Montero Seaworth. I'm delighted to be here. And first of all, I want to thank you for listening to me today. And also thank Miri Schoenfeld, because had she not invited me, I would not be here. So thank you very much. Thank you for the IAIE. And Tamara has been running me wild, I must tell you. And I have to thank the Moffett Institute. It's been an inspiration to arrive here and to see the innovations that you're doing. Believe me, you'll hear from me because you're going to be on the plateau. I can see that right away. And I'm happy to tell you that I heard about you because I read an article where you're cited by Belgian researchers as one of the outstanding institutes in education and professional development. So my congratulations to you. The second thing that I want to tell you is I want to thank my colleagues who have already presented, those from the United States, those from the Netherlands, and also those from Hungary, because that gives me license to skip some of the slides I've already made so that I won't repeat the same thing. And it also allows me to recognize the practitioners, especially two from Germany, that are with us today, because they're dealing with one of the areas that we most need to concern ourselves with, and that is vocational education. I also want to take the opportunity to have you not look at the script. I overwrite. I do that even with my students. But I tell them, remember, you'll keep it. The words are what you keep in your memory, not the lines. So I ask you not to try to read, but to follow my story, because the writing that you see is like my arms would be flailing around as a Latin American who wants to tell you una buena historia. So I hope you think that way. And also, I want you to think with me at the end about what is it that we can do in this wonderful field of teacher education and professionalism. So how do we reignite this passion? Well, I would like to start by saying that in thinking about how do we reignite it, we've been repeating much of the same thing for over 20 years. And much of the work that I do is with migrant and minority students. But I question in this keynote whether the approaches that we have used really meet their needs. Starting with the institutional level, do you realize that policies rarely get to be implemented in the way that they were enacted, especially in the classrooms, and that the research doesn't follow through from the evaluation back to the policy level? So institutional issues have to be questioned, and especially when they deal with migrant students and urban students, because they are the most disadvantaged in the system and the most in need of an education. The second thing that's very important that you think about is the instructional level. And why the instructional? Because this is where everything happens, that classroom where the spaces really collaborate to create an environment of learning, communities of learning, and the engagement of students on the cognitive, behavioral, and socio-emotional state. I heard a presentation today which was marvelous about it. And that is what we really need to be concerned all the time. Then the interpersonal state. Here we have to really be assured that what we're doing is very clear and that what we are relating to with our students is a possibility for them to have an engagement. And many of us will be turning to child-centered teaching and looking at the developmental stages of children, because that's part of their agency. That's how we know that they can move. And why do I say this? Because after 45 long years of teaching in 13 universities, including Harvard, I must tell you, at this stage of my life, having been working in Costa Rica, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, the Netherlands, and Boston, Massachusetts, with 8 ethnic groups, it's time to take some breathing and say, what can you say to an audience of educators about what one can learn from the context? And for me, my influences have been Paulo Freire first. You saw the picture there. I was a young lady. But you can see him when he came And I'm proud to say we brought him to the Harvard Graduate School of Education to work with the community, and secondly, with the faculty and the students. And these are moments of my life that will always stay with me. Henry Giroux was my director of my thesis, and I learned from him about the importance of intellectualness in teachers, that teachers can not simply be workers, they need to be intellectuals that really manage and move people with their teaching. Nona Lyons, who has recently died, and I have to tell you, Nona Lyons is the mother of portfolio and inquiry research. And I owe to her the opportunity that we work together on an experienced teachers model representing university and schools, what you are doing in many of these presentations, but ones that really elevated the teachers in those schools to be co-teachers with us and to basically teach us about their world. And finally, I have to go back to my roots. I take you back to my global south. I have to, because we have discovered interculturalidad, which is a way of thinking about intercultural education, but from the grassroots up, from what we say, from the estómago para afuera, from the stomach up. And so I'd like you to recognize that we need to look at not just the global south, the Middle East, but the convergence of those ideologies have to come together. The local practices I've been hearing a lot today and yesterday, we really need to become global. The local experiences are in many ways, if you research any community, you'll find dimensionalities of the global. So you don't really have to spend that much time doing that. And the critical thinking, why? Because I'm sorry to say, I'll use an American expression, we have pussyfooted around too much with the idea of critical theory, and it's time we get serious. It's time we get serious about teaching not simply how to understand the policies that underlie racism, colonization, and even gender issues, but to understand why are they still there if we've been educating for so long. And we also need to see how teachers play a role in that, because teachers may be the first detractors of saying, that's a hot topic, I can't talk about it, let me get away from it. I like to play with the soft topics. And finally, this whole notion of interculturalidad leads me to what we call in Mexico today and other parts of Latin America, reflexive dialogue, which begins with what you've started today here in these 2 days, talking to each other, hearing each other, listening to different points of view, and growing from those points of view. So with that, let me just go much more in a little speedier fashion through what we've already heard. We know that it is catastrophic right now. The lives we live are uncertain in every way. And I don't have to go through the list, but you can see. For me, the major concern is what's happening to the migrants. And it's interesting, a colleague of mine, Mohammed, sent a picture to me about what the difference is when you have people who die on a boat that they've paid very much money for, and they die in the Mediterranean versus the immigrants who are crossing the Mediterranean. And I ask you to think about, what does this mean for us in teacher education, in professionalization, and intercultural education? We're adapting to the times. We have to fast track knowledge, quick, fast knowledge. Best practices solution for everything. Do you realize how many best practices we have written over the last 15 years? There must be thousands of books on best practices. Standardization, commercialization. But the biggest concern is, why are students leaving school? And after having done a research study for the PISL Erasmus project, we have found, after looking over 275 sources, that the single most important reason is because a student doesn't feel they belong in school, and they don't have a relationship even with their teacher. The moment that teacher pays attention to that child, the decision-making, which starts very early, can be deferred. And I would ask you to think about how we push students out of school. McDermott, an anthropologist, once said, Marta, do you realize why we have a culture of failure? We need failure, otherwise how do we express success? It is to our advantage to have failure. So I ask you to think about these issues, because the last thing we also need to focus on is how do we bridge parents, especially parents of migrants who may have a very different ideology, but we want one size fits all. Bring parents to school, they'll all adapt, we'll have coffee, we'll have tea, and that will get them together, without realizing that many of them are asking for, keep my child well in school, keep him safe and teach him. So it's a very different notion. So why does the passion cease? Think about it. Teachers are no longer viewed as professionals. They're underpaid. And the profession is meaningless. Who wants to work from 6 in the morning, going to school till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, doing grading of papers, then community service over the weekends, and putting up with parents that bang on your doors? Not a great profession in some sense. It's government-directed reforms, and we have had reforms. There's an article that I wrote over 20 years ago on the reforms, and after I got over reform number 75, I said, enough is enough. Then performativity is the major demand that we have. We are performers. We are divas, in a way, in our classrooms in many ways. And it is not the critical thinking that we're looking for, but it is how well we perform and how much we are liked. As many students say, oh, I like my teacher. And the teacher says, I don't like my students. And yet you have this whole notion of who likes who. And then the teachers need to encompass knowledge, skills, and dispositions for all. It doesn't matter. You have to be a jack of all trades. So the meeting of the demands for diversity go beyond simply the linguistic and cultural needs of the classroom. And they demand getting into the community, getting into the homes of children. It demands really social work conditions. So my question is, how do you bring the lives of teachers close to that of the understanding of the lived everyday experience of students who are poor, marginalized, and disenfranchised? And how are teachers equipped to do that? And what supports do they have? Well, I feel we need to reignite that passion and professionalism. And we need to think about learning something new, about really transmitting, creating actions, the passion of motivation, seeking, that willingness to learn is a real passion. But if we consider that the passion derives as we feel as teachers, I would bring one word from Freire. I loved his word was always, I want to provocar. I want to provoke you. That was his way of teaching. And one of his provocations was, we start with curiosity. That's the first element of a good teacher. The curiosity that we get excited in teaching new ideas, engaging students. And therefore, if we start there, it's possible to go from the feeling and the passive state we may be in into action. And so in reigniting this whole process, I'm not going to go over all of this because it's too much and it's already been talked about. But in teacher education, I think the changes we've gone through have been zip-zop, up, down, in, out, and round and around. And one of the concerns that I have is we've created so many programs as Band-Aid programs to help children, not as intrinsically directed towards the children themselves, but to make the school look good. When I arrived in Massachusetts to teach actually in one of the schools, I was teaching at Harvard and I was working in Chelsea, Massachusetts, I was told, listen, we count the number of children we have by their Latin names, by their Hispanic names. And I said, but Jerry Gomez has the Gomez name, but he's Irish. And they had counted the names as the way that they could count the Latino kids for after school or free lunch. So the way we even think about these children is already equivocal. And I think that we need to reconstruct the notion of diversity in a different way, but think about it in terms of that not everything is intercultural education, and intercultural education is not the same in Mexico, it is not the same in China, it is not the same in the United States, and it's certainly not the same in the Netherlands. And one of the reasons is because we live in neoliberal forums, and we are experiencing globalization of the greatest dimensions. Think about how we're scored. PISA tests are given to people. We score with this test, this other international test, and that's how we line up our teachers and say, you're doing poorly, you're going back to the workhorse, and you're going back to develop yourself. So I feel we've been missing the target, and part of this is that we are really in a market-oriented policy of teaching. And we're supporting input-output models, which you learned when you were in teacher education. Those were the models of the 1920s. They are old, outdated models, but we're still following them. And as our dear colleague Gorski says, niceness isn't enough. We can be nice with intercultural education, but good intentions don't go very far. And we do surface diversity, you know, because deep diversity would mean we would have to really even expose our viewpoints to students and have them question, and why do you think that way, Miss Montero? Or why do you think they don't call me Miss Montero? My rule with every student is they call me maestra. That's my name, to be the teacher. So we've commodified teaching, and the socio-emotional part of teaching, oops, sorry. Wait. Hold on. The socio-emotional containment that we've created is to leave emotions at the door of the parents. That's where we see emotions go. So for me, the professionalization really is an important part of our lives. Teacher education has to be professionalized to the highest degree. But there's a disjuncture and there's flux. And as Cochrane Smith and others have shown, is that we really need to validate teacher practices and put them into active research. I had the opportunity to be in a session earlier on where exactly this was being talked about at Stanford, the need to really make research-based learning part of the teacher education, not only here, but everywhere. And so, according to Tato, she says, use-inspired research and inquiry culture really fortifies professionalization. She's a colleague of mine also, a Mexican like me, so we were in contact with this discussion. The mainstream teachers and the administrators are all concerned with the quality of education, but quality of education, as Noel McGinn often said, is very context specific, and to try to make it sound like we can export it as a universal notion is problematic. We really need to look at quality in the context of the country or the specific local area that we're working with. So for us, one of the concerns is that within this professionalization, there is segregation and there is discrimination. And that leads us to then ask the questions, what are the perspectives right now? Well, there's commodification of education. We're really dealing with multiple professions because we have a public scenario and we have a private scenario. And it depends on which one we choose, but the idea of an authentic democratic activism needs to be there. And like Raquel today mentioned in her class, that's the democracy that we're looking for, that activism that makes us regard and consider the actions that we're doing as morally important. The collaborative cultures, we know about that. We've worked with that for a long time. And the public domain means that we do have discussions of power and discourse and subjectivity. But interestingly enough, because of our internationalization, we then have high-stakes survival, because that's how we cope with that. And we then see enacted discourses of power in the way that teachers may be able to influence the quality and character of their work. So professionalization, although some people have said, let's get rid of it, it's here to stay. And as it's here to stay, then we need to learn to teach beyond the local boundaries, teach in that globalized world. All that happens at the local level can be experienced at that global level. So I'm not going to go through all of this because it was my reflection, but just to tell you this much. For me, the policy driven I've seen over the years is not really configured by teachers, but by administrators who do not know the classroom. They don't get to the classroom. The accountability of the teacher, imagine your accountability based on the scores of students means that if they fail, you're failing. That's a very, very damning lesson. And the idea that diversity experiences are really problematized by pull-out classes, language reinforcement classes, and this, it's like a little dab will do you. Just give you a little bit and that should be taking care of it. But it's mandates, checklists that we're seeing being part of this whole institutional level. At the instructional level, my greatest concern is the fears that teachers have in the classroom. The inability to be outspoken because their contract may not be renewed, or the inability to be able to deal with students directly in ways that they would like to. And the difficulty of seeing students as static, identifying segment of a population rather than to understand they're part of that colonial past. They've been shaped and formed by that past, and we need to understand it. So I think that interculturality becomes more of an issue of knowledge and competences. We need to link it to the political problems and issues. And finally, at the interpersonal level, teacher perspectives about students do count, because I, as a teacher, may already judge you and define what your status will be, and it can be towards really non-success. And the significance of peer groups, we've done very little. There's tremendous research in the United States on peer groups. I found out that in the Netherlands, it started only a couple of years ago, but peer groups are really critical in helping define the boundaries that students may have. And the relationship buildings, we go back to that. That's where it all begins. So just to tell you where I stand on teaching migrants, I will tell you first that migrant children are not like any other children in the classroom. Please do not make that mistake. They have undergone migration as a traumatic experience. It's in their bones, which affects their integration into classrooms. Their families often make the decision to move, although you see more and more unaccompanied youth traveling. But in many cases, it's forced, displaced, and it's traumatic. So let's not make less of it than what it is. Secondly, being an effective teacher for immigrant children means that we have to have strategies that work not only with the children and their age levels, but with their parents as well. Do you know what it's like to tell a Latino parent, oops, your daughter now is using sexual contraception, and the mother says, when did I lose control of that? Because she doesn't know what goes on in the schools. Or the notion of cultural match and mismatch. I wrote articles on this. Does a Latino belong with a Latino? Does a black teacher belong with the black kids? Does an Asian teacher belong with the Asian? And I found over years and years of looking at the literature that it is not a matching that works. It is good teaching that works. A good teacher recognizes the child where he, she is and will work with that child. It is not a cultural issue per se. The other thing is that for many migrant teachers, and I was one of them, believe me, it was not easy to fit into a university where you were told you were a minority, although I kept saying, how can I be a minority? My father is a psychiatrist, and we come from a family that is not poor. And yet I was told you are a minority because you count in the minority ranks. And all of a sudden, as I was teaching, I found out that being a teacher also meant that you had to give up your own ideas about your childhood, your own pedagogy, your own way of being, because you had to fit into the criteria of the institution. And fitting in is a very traumatic experience. In Spanish, to educar means very different thing than to instruct, because educar is a social, cultural learning, teaching of manners, of ways to be, of ways to respond to your teacher, of even the usted and the tú form. All of that is constituted there. And then the question I have is how cultural backgrounds and beliefs enter into the notions of best practices. That's one thing we need to say. And then how to work, with children in be able to develop them into political activism. I won't go through all of this. I'm happy to share it with you, but I will just say, to me, urban school sites are still oppositional sites. And this was written in 1989. They still are having the same thing. Burnout of teachers, the poverty of the schools and how it's lived out, and the failure of students. That hasn't changed. You have to ask yourself why or why not. Then the other issue that I've learned from it is that the culture of the school is often unknown to the kids. They spend most of their time reinterpreting what they think that culture is, and segmented assimilation occurs. And I just want to show you the map for segmented assimilation. When a child enters with a home language, they have BICS, they have the basic intercultural communication with that they have at home. But then in the school, they're given an academic language which they must immediately jump into and be able to do with abstract learning. Yet the educational of their parents may be at a level where they don't have reading as such, so therefore they are expected to jump in and be able to react immediately. The neighborhood, the barrio, the funds of knowledge of the barrio are also an additional part that has to be looked at. And finally, the influence of the home culture, the acceptance of the child in the school, the sense of belonging, and the opportunity structures will tell you whether you have upward assimilation, downward assimilation, or selective assimilation. I was fortunate in that my parents chose selective assimilation, and that's why I speak English as well as I speak my native language. Now, the lessons from the Dutch school has been a revelation for me, because there's nothing like being in a school system where ethnicity is not talked about per se. So you don't hear the labels. And although the quotas used to be there, thank God they've done away with black schools and they've done away with the division of white schools. But that was the language that was used when I first came to the Netherlands. And for me, the interesting thing about nationality of parents as a determinant of education means a lot, because even though there is a tracking system, it's tracked in a way that children know what to expect. And it's the peers that help navigate those different routes that they'll have, either through general education, university education, or vocational education. And the opportunity structures that the Dutch government provides, not only to teachers, families, and students, is unbelievable. The fact that you can have a gap year, what a luxury. The cultural exchanges and the notion of global citizenship is embedded into the education. I must praise the intercultural educational programs. And by the way, bilingual education theory began in the Netherlands over 45 years ago, then receded, and now there's a movement towards, again, bilingual schools. But it's a very notable country to see what's happening. So in terms of the second generation, all I can say from Alba, who is very much a conservative in the research of migrants, is that race, ethnicity, and religion are no longer strong identity markers as they were in the past centuries. But we do see that the education of the second generation is better compared to the first. And in fact, Latinos are doing very well in higher education. The problem is that it's more the women who are exceeding the men in college education. And in fact, it is the men who are dropping out, and a greater divorce rate, by the way. So you have upward social mobility, seeing the models of social reproduction, and Asians outdo all of the ethnic groups in the United States. And there is a migrant advantage that you can see in France and Sweden, because given opportunities, migrants will excel natives. Give them that opportunity and they will do it. So the social class origins are real major determinants. And what is the difference? It takes 2 to 3 generations for my Latino students to succeed economically, socially in the United States. 2 to 3 generations. It takes in the Netherlands 1 generation. How do you explain that with parents with lesser education? Because there is an infrastructure that has been built around the care of and well-being of the citizen, future citizen. So the motivation for learning is very strong for L2, and you will see incremental amalgamations. So what I'd like to come now to is talking about concientização, which is Paulo Freire's idea. I'm almost there. Concientização, these are the kernels that we need to think about. How do we become conscious of what we're doing enough to activate that political action? And I have to tell you, it took me a long time to do this, but I worked with Paulo Freire, and so for me, this is his message. We need to understand how we liberate ourselves from our own limitations to be able to make reflection part of our daily lives. And of course, Henry Giroux, talking about the intellectuals, and Nona Lyons, I just have to say, it's her portfolio approach that completely turned around University College Cork in every subject area, and she was able to create a total new dimension for the school. God bless her soul, she left us inquiry portfolio and the kinds of thinking that we need. And then the last thing I will say, Paul Gorski, I'm sure you will read him, but let me just say, because I have to give credit here, is the decolonial critique. The interculturalidad is a political statement. We can no longer simply say we agree with political stances. We really have to be motivated to take that leap. And that interculturalidad means creating that third space of convivencia where we really begin to talk with each other as we are here, but saying, let's have a mission to do this in X school, Y school, and make it happen. And so for me, that interculturality begins with problematization, expanding discourses, engaging the affective, which we talked about today, the material, exploring relationships, making it possible to be something, and culture should be a resource. It should not be an attribute that we place on kids and label them with. It should be a resource that we can really see, and I love this statement, I'll end with this, moving away from viewing culture as a noun, beliefs, attitudes, values, towards viewing it as a verb, referring to the process of the historical construction of normal, the us from them. I think with that I will end. I won't give time, but I will talk about Armando if you want to afterwards, and talk about the laboratories, which are an extension. They're very much like your work, Rachel, very much, and it's happening in Latin America. So I bring the gift from the global south to the global north, because I believe the global north and the Middle East might be illuminated by this and might experience a good feeling of the future. Thank you.
אז אני אומר שאנחנו נמצאים בעצם באיזשהו אירוע מאוד דרמטי. אנחנו נמצאים באירוע מאוד מאוד דרמטי שהוא בעצם מציב בפנינו שאלות מאוד גדולות בגלל המאה ה-21. לצערי הרב, רוב האנשים בקהילת החינוך שאני פוגש הם אנשים מפוחדים, שהם מרגישים שהשינויים שניצבים לפתחיהם יכולים לייתר את תפקידם, ובדרך כלל כשאתה מרגיש מאוים אתה נהיה יותר שמרן. ובעצם הסכנה הגדולה היא שהשינויים הטכנולוגיים בהרבה מאוד מובנים ישיגו את החינוך לאחור. כי בעצם המחשבה שאולי עומדים לקחת לי את המקצוע אומרת, רגע, אז בואו נוסיף עוד בחינות, אז בואו נוסיף עוד מדדים, אז בואו נעשה עוד דברים, כי אנחנו צריכים לשמור עכשיו על עצמנו, אנחנו צריכים לשמור על האירוע. ולכן מתרחש פה בעצם איזשהו תהליך שהוא תהליך מאוד מעניין, אבל התהליך הזה, כפי שאמרתי, הוא תהליך עולמי, הוא לא תהליך ישראלי. הוא בא לידי ביטוי קודם כל בעובדה שנכון להיום מערכות חינוך מתעסקות כמו תחנת דלק. יש משאבה שנקראת משרד החינוך, ששם מחליטים על החומר. המשאבה הזאת שולחת צינור שהיא באמצעות מפקחים, מחוזות, מטה עצום ומיותר ברובו. ובסוף הפירמידה נמצא מתדלק, שזה בעצם המורה, שכל התפקיד שלו זה לשפוך את הדלק לתוך התלמיד, כלומר את החומר לתוך התלמיד. וכמו המתדלק בתחנה ליד הבית שלי, גם נותן לו בסוף, כשהוא גומר את הדלק, הוא נותן לי בקצה של האוטו איזה מכה ואומר לי, סע. אז זה בערך מה שאנחנו עושים עם תלמידים בסוף כיתה י"ב. וזה בעצם נובע מהעובדה שגם השיטות שבהם אנחנו נוהגים למדוד את התלמידים שלנו, אז אני תמיד משתמש בדוגמה הבאה, אני אומר ככה, מורה שנכנס לכיתה והוא מופתע מהציונים של התלמידים במבחן, כדאי שנפטר אותו. אם יש תלמידים שקיבלו ציונים קצת אחרים, זה יכול להיות שתי סיבות. האחת, מורה פרטי, והשנייה לא אפרט. אבל אני יכול לומר שההבדל בין הבת הראשונה שלי לבין הבת השישית שלי, זה כשהבת הראשונה שלי כל פעם שהיה איזה בכי קטן, מדדנו לחום עם מדחום, לא כזה, עם כספית. בבת האחרונה שלי כבר היינו מסתכלים בעיניים וידענו אם יש חום או אין חום. וזה בערך ההבדל בין מדידה להערכה. מערכת החינוך עדיין מתעקשת לדחוף מדחומים לכל מיני איברים, בזמן שבעצם היא צריכה להיות מסוכלת, להסתכל בעיניים ולהבין מה המצב האמיתי. ובעצם האתגר הזה נובע משורה ארוכה, סתם פה, נחזור לזה, דברנו על הערכה, זאת דוגמה לתעודה, זה נראה כמו, יושב פה חופרי, אז הוא מכיר אלופים וטייסים וכאלה, זה נראה כמו סיכה של מלחמה כזאת, של צבאים, למי שזוכר, ככה נראה תעודה, תעודה של אנשים שסיימו בית ספר, תראו איזה מדהים, זו תעודה אמיתית בפינלנד, תעודה של כיתה א' ותעודה של כיתה ב', ככה נראה תעודה בעולם של הערכה לעומת עולם של מדידה. אז אני חושב שעכשיו אנחנו ככה חוזרים לתוך העניין, אני חושב שיש כמה וכמה אתגרים מאוד מאוד משמעותיים. האתגר הראשון זה שבעצם המורים הפסיקו להיות הבעלים של הידע, הידע הוא לא נחלתם של המורים, ישנם הרבה מאוד ערוצים שבאמצעותם תלמידים יכולים לדעת הרבה יותר ממורים, בעיקר מורים שמשחזרים מערכי שיעורים קיימים. הבעיה השנייה זה מה שהילד שלי אומר אצלנו בבית, אבל אני מניח שזה רק הבן שלי, בטח אחרים לא אומרים את זה, מה יצא לי מזה? כלומר עברנו לתרבות של אני במקום תרבות של אנחנו, כל הסיפור של קולקטיב, כל הסיפור של קבוצה של קהילה, לא מעניין היום חלק גדול מהתלמידים, כל מה שמעניין אותו זה, אני לא ידעתי בכיתה י"א איך עושים ממוצע לקבלה לאוניברסיטה. ילד היום כשהוא בכיתה י' צריך לבחור את המגמה, הוא כבר יודע לעשות את כל החשבונות ומה הסיפור ואיך זה עובד, אנחנו נמצאים באיזשהו עולם שלם של התפרקות האני. הדבר השלישי זה מה שקרה, זה על מה מושתתים היחסים, יש התפרקות של 3 דברים מאוד מאוד מהותיים שהיוו את העוגן של החיים שלנו. הדבר הראשון זה בעבר היה איזשהו חוזה בלתי כתוב על איך מחלקים את הטובין, איך מחלקים את הכלכלה, איך מייצרים שוויון הזדמנויות, איך מייצרים איזשהו ערך כזה שבו אנשים שנמצאים באזורים מוחלשים יוכלו להתקדם. החוזה הזה הופר, אפשר להסתכל על תקציב המדינה האחרון, הוא לא מעניין אף אחד היום, הוא מעניין לאיזה מגזר אתה שייך, לאיזה קהילה אתה שייך, ולא בעצם איך אנחנו מייצרים איזשהו שוויון עתידי. הדבר השני, פעם היחסים היו מושתתים על איזושהי מילה שאני יודע שהיא כבר לא מדוברת, אבל אני אזכיר אותה, חוקים, זאת אומרת יש כללים, וכללי המשחק האלה הם אלה שבסופו של דבר מכוונים את העניין. והדבר השלישי, שהוא לא חלוקת טובין והוא לא חוקים, זאת מילה שאתם ממש כבר לא זוכרים, זאת מילה שנקראת מוסר. זאת אומרת, היה גם ברור שמעבר לחוקים ומעבר לכללים של חלוקה, יש איזשהו מוסר פנימי שהוא הדבר שבאמצעותו אנחנו מדברים, ובעצם מה שקרה זה שבסופו של דבר על מה מושתתים היחסים התפרק לגמרי. והדבר האחרון, יש מיקור חוץ של זיכרון. זיכרון, כמו שאתם יודעים, היסטוריה זה מה שקרה לאחרים, זיכרון זה מה שקרה לי. פעם הייתי צריך לזכור את מספר הטלפון של אשתי, את תאריכי יום הולדת של הילדים, תאריכי יום הולדת של הילדים הקרובים. זה לא פעולה ביולוגית או מוחית או נוירולוגית, זאת פעולה זהותית. היום אני לא צריך לזכור כלום. פייסבוק יגיד לי בבוקר, היום יש יום הולדת לאריאל. זהו, מספיק. לא צריך לדעת כלום. ובעצם ברגע שאנחנו נמצאים בתקופה שיש בה מיקור חוץ של הזיכרון, אז גם אנחנו מגיעים לאיזושהי מין תופעה מאוד מאוד מוזרה של שחיקה בזהות של אנשים, ואנחנו פוגשים יותר ויותר אנשים שהם צמחי מים עם שורשים מאוד מאוד דלים והיעדר של זיקה פנימית עמוקה לתוך דבר שלם. זה רק להראות את הדבר האחרון, וזה הבינה המלאכותית, זה הדבר האחרון שמתחולל. אני רק מסתכל על עצמי, אני כבר קשיש וזקן, ואני רק מסתכל על מה קרה לי מכיתה א' ועד כיתה י"ב, עד היום, עד איפה שאני חי היום. תראו מה קרה לבן אדם אחד ב-40 שנה. תסתכלו מה קרה לבן אדם אחד ב-40 שנה. כלומר, אני בעצם, כמות השינויים שחלו בתקופה כל כך קצרה, מייצרת מבוכה מאוד מאוד גדולה אצל הרבה מאוד מהאנשים, וזה מוביל לאיזושהי שאלה מאוד מאוד גדולה של מה תכלית החינוך בעת הזאת. זה מייצר ייאוש אצל הרבה מאוד אנשים, זה מייצר תחושה שאנחנו לא רלוונטיים, וכבר אמרתי בהתחלה, וכשאני לא רלוונטי, אז מה אני עושה? Back to the basic, אני חוזר חזרה אל השורשים, ואני בעצם הופך להיות דמות מאוד מאוד, אני אנכרוניסט ואני הופך להיות עוד יותר אנכרוניסט. אני חושב שהחזרה של משרד החינוך בהגברת המדידה היא רק ביטוי להתמודדות לא נכונה עם ההתפתחות הטכנולוגית העצומה. זאת אומרת, במקום להגיד בואו נשחק את המשחק ובואו נבין מה עושים, אז בעצם יש כאן תהליך של חזרה לאחור והחזרה של הדבר הזה. מה עושים? אז אני רוצה להציע שתי הצעות שאני חושב שהן הצעות מאוד מהותיות. הצעה הראשונה שאני רוצה להציע זה שחינוך צריך להיות מושתת על 3 שאלות מרכזיות, ושלושת השאלות האלה הם אלה שצריכות להיות הבסיס והתשתית של כל תוכנית לימודים. 3 השאלות הם: מי אני? באיזה עולם אני רוצה לחיות? ומה התפקיד שלי בתוך הדבר הזה? איך אני מצמצם את הפער בין מי אני לבין באיזה עולם אני רוצה לחיות? השאלה של מי אני נחלקת ל2, מי אני מבחינת הזהות, לאיזה קהילה אני שייך, לאיזה מורשת אני שייך, מי אני, מה הכישורים שלי, מה הם היכולות שלי, ובעצם במובן העמוק של המילה, כאשר אני יודע לענות על השאלה מי אני, ואני חושב שרוב התלמידים שמסיימים מערכות חינוך בישראל ובעולם, לא יודעים לענות על השאלה מי אני, אלא יודעים לענות על השאלה מה צריך. מה צריך כדי להיות מצליחן? מה צריך כדי להגיע רחוק? מה צריך כדי לרכוש מעמד? מה צריך כדי להרוויח כסף? אבל השאלה מי אני, כן, השאלה מי אני היא שאלה דרמטית. השאלה השנייה, באיזה עולם אני רוצה לחיות? שזאת בעצם שאלה של מה החזון, בעיקר בהתאם לשלושת הכללים שדיברתי עליהם מקודם, ומתוך כך תלמידים בבתי ספר צריכים להיות אנשים שמונעים למשמעות, מונעים לעשייה. תוכנית הלימודים צריכה להיות לעניות דעתי מותאמת לאותם נושאים שארגון האומות המאוחדות הגדיר שאלה הם הצרות הגדולות של העולם, ובעצם תוכנית הלימודים צריכה להיות בסיס, כל מה שאנחנו לומדים זה כדי להפוך את העולם להיות טוב יותר. גם אם אנחנו נכנסים לשיעור ביולוגיה או לשיעור טבע או לשיעור ספרות, כל המטרה של כל מה שאנחנו לומדים זה כדי שהעולם שאנחנו חיים בתוכו יהיה עולם טוב יותר. ואני אסיים את הדבר האחרון. אני חושב שמעולם, בעקבות הבינה המלאכותית, לא הייתה הזדמנות גדולה כל כך למערכת החינוך להתחיל לחנך. המחשבים, הטכנולוגיה, אולי תחליף את דרכי ההוראה, אבל היא לא תחליף את הלב והנשמה. אנחנו בעצם נמצאים בפני רגע היסטורי מרגש שמאפשר לנו להתמקד יותר בטיפוח ופיתוח קשרים אישיים בין מורים לתלמידים. אנחנו נמצאים ברגע מרגש שבו נוכל באמת להתחיל לדבר על ערכים, ובמקום שנפחד מיכולתנו ללמד בצורה מיטבית, כדאי שנתרגש מהסיכוי שלנו לחנך באמת. תודה רבה לכם.